Welcome to the first Thought Talk strand of the Galway International Arts Festival, Autumn Edition, a big mouthful. This is an unusual version of the festival, which takes place against the backdrop of the COVID-19 epidemic, which has turned our lives upside down and has also particularly hit arts events very badly. Many people have lost their livelihoods. Beautiful venues like this lie idle. Tonight we're very delighted to be here and to be safely here. So we're very proud to present a varied and interesting festival and to embed our wonderful speakers for First Thought within it. A very warm welcome to our online viewers who are joining us live for each of the talks during these sessions. You can ask questions tonight if you like, and they will be relayed to our chairperson if you want to get involved in the Q&A at the end of this session. Remember, you can watch all of these talks later on the festival YouTube and Facebook channels, or listen to them on the festival podcast series. First Thought talks are presented in partnership with our partner, NUI Galway. Our nearest neighbour seems to be in an ongoing state of division and uncertainty for the last number of years, a situation which has been further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. With the arrival of Brexit, something that we've all forgotten about, but is still there, like some horrible beast lurking in the background, there's a distinct possibility before the end of the year that we're going to see this happening. So where to next for an increasingly disunited kingdom? John Lanchester, who you see on the screen behind me here, this is our first screen event tonight, so we're hoping that it all goes as well as it can. John is a well-known novelist and journalist, writes for the London Review of Books, and he's known for explaining the 2007 financial crisis to us all. I still remember what a collateralized debt obligation is from reading his stuff. I don't know if that's any good to me anymore. I hope it isn't any good to me anymore, because they were very bad things. So he's streaming into us from London. And Fintan O'Toole, who needs no introduction. He's one of Ireland's best-known journalists, and he's known for, among other things, explaining Brexit and its roots to us all and to the English, which was tremendous fun at the time. They're both going to discuss the situation and bring their considerable analytical powers to bear on that most distressful country. Our moderator, who we're delighted to have with us, is Martina Fitzgerald, journalist and author of Madam Politician, a fascinating study of Irish female politicians. And many of you remember her as RTE political correspondent from 2013 to 2018. She is going to guide our two eminent panelists through the vexed issue of the state of the UK. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I think before we begin, I think we should acknowledge the hard work and planning that has gone into this series of talks by Katrina and all the team. So a round of applause to them for getting the show on. Now, we are discussing tonight the state of the United Kingdom. And for some time now, as Katrina was pointing out, Britain has been consumed by caustic debate about immigration, nationalism, elitism, racism, public services, civil service, and so on. And that's without mentioning COVID-19, and of course, to paraphrase Game of Thrones, Brexit is coming. So we're very fortunate this evening to have two very astute observers of British history, society, politics, and economic affairs to tease out these issues. And I'm going to start with our video link, guest John, because in 2018 I was looking at an article that you wrote. And this is not to catch you out, but you wrote how fast that decade had gone by since the credit crunch in 2008, and that you also pointed out some of the changes in that period. And in 2008, Gordon Brown was the British Prime Minister. Ken Livingstone was the London Mayor. MySpace was the biggest social network. Does anyone remember that? I had to look it up. And also the odds of Leicester winning the Premiership were 5,000 to 1. And you kindly put that in context by pointing out the odds of finding the Loch Ness Monster were 500 to 1. Now, that was, 2008. But what were the odds you suggested in 2008 of Donald Trump becoming president of the United States, Theresa May even leading the Conservative Party, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party, and of course, Britain voting to leave Brexit? So you wrote that article in 2018. Now, I'm going to put to you, hasn't there been seismic changes in just less than 2 years in British politics, society, when you look at Boris Johnson, the Conservatives, COVID, and even in the first few months of this year, he's evaporated a 26-point lead. So what's your prognosis on the state of the United Kingdom today?
Well, I think there has been astonishing change, but in some ways it's been in the same direction of travel. The themes of populism and of sort of oversimplified solution to complex problems, the problems essentially to do with globalization, modernity, borders, all those things. But the direction of travel hasn't really changed, I don't think, since 2018. It's been more spectacular and more lurid, but a lot of the themes were already there, in embryo. It's sort of everything has really spiraled, and then COVID has added this extraordinary dimension of additional catastrophe.
And Fintan, to you on that, are you amazed at the changes that have taken place in a very short period of time in Britain? Maybe you're not, but it does seem extraordinary, because even John was writing in 2019 that he was hoping the next few years would be better.
It's change, isn't it? But also stuck. So it's this weird conjunction of, in one way, like dramatic change. The extraordinary rise of Boris Johnson, perhaps even the very fast fall of Boris Johnson, perhaps. All of these kind of dramatic political events, and yet this sense of being completely stuck. And stuck at that Brexit moment, really, because it's a moment you can't get out of. It's a moment which cannot be fulfilled. So, of course, the drama of the pandemic has, to some extent, overtaken it. But as you were saying in the introduction, it's you've got these layers of different things, really, that are there, and in a way, there's just this. Two things that are big, so even if you leave aside the pandemic, that are entirely unresolved and are nowhere closer to being resolved now than they were, I think, in 2016. One is Brexit itself. What the hell does it actually mean? What's it for? What's gained from it? And the second is the identity crisis within the UK itself. Right? So, in a way, one of the things that feeds into Brexit is the pre-existing crisis of British identity, the rise of Scottish nationalism, to a lesser extent Welsh nationalism, the Belfast Agreement with its long-term implications for Northern Ireland, all of that stuff then kind of producing an English nationalism, which results in Brexit. But Brexit's not an answer to the English question, And I remember when shortly after the Brexit vote, one of the things that came into my head was Bernard Shaw, whom I'm fond of, who loved provoking the English in particular. But over 100 years ago, Shaw, wrote a piece asking the question, are the English ready for self-government? And of course it was humorous and provocative, and it was taking the piss out of the colonial condescension towards Ireland. Is Ireland ready for self-government? Are all the other colonies ready for self-government? But it's become, I think, a very potent question, because really where we seem to be heading is towards some form of English self-government, and it's not going well, partly because it's not even acknowledged.
And I'm going to start at the very beginning, the State of the Union, because you've picked up on that there. And John, if you look at even their response to COVID, it harks back to Brexit. Different parts of the United Kingdom are responding different ways. The total confusion over the quarantine rules for Portugal that caused passengers just, such confusion. But will we have a union, post-Brexit? Will we have a union? The State of the Union doesn't look too good at the moment, given that everybody is acting in different ways.
No, I mean, it's clearly chaotic and dysfunctional to an extent it's really impossible to exaggerate. I think some of the thing about quarantines is that the devolved administrations really, really get a deep buzz out of embarrassing Johnson. And so one of the things about, changing the rules, so the rules on quarantine is coming back from France. which is where I was at the time. It was Nicola Sturgeon, who insisted on bringing it forward the next day. The UK government wanted to give people until the Sunday morning, and the Scots insisted on doing it on Saturday. And it's not clear to me that that protects a particularly large number of people, but it does a fantastic job of emphasising the chaos and dysfunction between the devolved administrations and the UK government. I think, the union is clearly in an extremely weak position at the moment. I think the structural weaknesses in the constitution of the UK, the fact that we have this sort of semi-devolution, and the fact that creates these sort of soft spots in how the state functions. Brexit put enormous pressure on that, and it has taken it to a completely different level. It's difficult to stress the quarantine thing in particular. It feels like a fairly profound failure of the state here, because, as I say, we came back from France. There were all these dramatic forms you were supposed to fill out, things you're supposed to do, and then none of it's checked at all. There were no border checks when we came through. We quarantined when we got back. Luckily, we stayed in Germany for a week en route, so we'd already done a week of quarantine. But, completely self-isolated, didn't go out. But it felt like something slightly bizarre, but it's like an honour system. There's no enforcement, there's no state mechanism involved in that at any point at all. And it feels really as if there's a kind of, at a moment when, you can't get a clearer opportunity for a state to function efficiently than a pandemic. You think, what are states for? To keep their citizens safe. And it's surreal and disturbing that there's a kind of just an inaction.
And you're living it, Fintan, you're observing it, luckily from a distance. But on that theme of just the fact that Scotland and Wales are doing their own things, and the impact this has, and I know it's a theme you want to explore on Britishness.
Yeah, we're talking about, I suppose, what's changed, and certainly one of the things that would have been utterly unimaginable 5 years ago, was that in a pandemic, a public health emergency, right, which does not discriminate about whether you're Scottish or Welsh or British or Irish, doesn't care. So you would think that if there was going to be a moment of national unity, that would bring everybody together, and it would become irrelevant whether you were in Edinburgh or you were in London or in Belfast. You would think this would be it, and instead. And this is the measure of change, right, is that people have been looking to their devolved governments as the source of authority. And not only that, but by and large, Scotland and Wales, and to some extent Belfast actually, have been doing better than London. You've actually had this situation where increasingly Johnson's government has had to follow Sturgeon. And in relation to the education results, for example, we've seen that. But also in quite a number of details about pandemic management, they've had to do it. And that just was not imaginable. It just wasn't imaginable. But the reason it's happening is the same reason we didn't follow London. So if you think about this, what would have happened in a pandemic 5 years ago? What would the first thought on the minds of Irish civil servants have been? Oh, I wonder what they're doing in London, And not entirely unreasonably, it's not just cultural cringe. You would have said, look, they're really expert at stuff. They've got more resources, they've more scientists, let's find out what they're doing and really take that very seriously. Would that thought have occurred to a single civil servant or politician in Dublin when the pandemic was breaking out in February? No. Why? Because there's a huge crisis of governance. You cannot elect a liar. You can't elect somebody who's known as a liar. You can't elect somebody who's known as a showman, a bluffer, and expect then to have governing authority. You can have one or the other, but you can't have both.
There are so many issues to be explored there, and we're going to start off with substance over celebrity. This is a time for science, for facts, for detail, and none of which you would associate with Boris Johnson necessarily. And John, you once wrote that he has based his career on celebrity, that he put on a buffoon mask and to become a celebrity, and now he can't take it off. And Fintan, you have, you have written and pointed to, he's kind of operated, according to Oscar Wilde, quote, he treats all things, to paraphrase, serious things trivially, and serious things trivially, and gives a priority to the trivial.
Yeah.
John, he's not the man for this time. Is that a fair comment, or are we being harsh?
No, a grotesque understatement, I'd say. I mean, I think it would be almost impossible to find anyone worse. I mean, we got to this position. It's like buses. You wait for the worst prime minister in British history, and then three come along in a row. I mean, Cameron was a catastrophe. It seemed impossible to do worse than that. May astonishingly managed to do worse than that. And then Johnson has taken it to a completely other level. Partly for ideological reasons, this thing about the gap between the devolved administrations and the UK government is that they do, in Westminster, the Tories do believe in laissez-faire. They were slow to lock down, and they're reluctant to intervene on the kind of scale and with the kind of severity that you need, just because they have this sort of belief that doesn't really apply in a pandemic about the primacy of individual liberty and the pointlessness of state action. It's clearly just a maladaptive belief. It's an ideology you can't afford to have at the moment like this. But I think there's also, in addition to that, just a simple question of competence. I mean, anyone who's followed Johnson's career could tell you that premiership is certain to end in disaster. He's not interested in detail. He's not interested in administration. His sort of natural instincts are those of an after-dinner speaker. He's lazy. He phones it in. I think the disaster that was always going to happen is just this, unfortunately, a catastrophic global pandemic. And Johnson was always going to implode. He just is that person. He's just very straightforwardly not up to the job. And just there is this unfortunate, tragic coincidence of a set of circumstances that he's just not capable of rising to. And that, by the way, is leaving out Brexit, which is basically his fault.
And can I take that, Fintan, that point? You were trying to cheer us all up, I think, during the pandemic by writing a column on 5 things that are good news, or 5 things to make us happy. And one of them was the strong men are weak.
Yeah.
And Boris Johnson obviously falls into that category, but he's not on his own. There is a kind of typical leader that has risen through populism.
Yeah, Johnson is obviously in one way part of a much broader movement towards these kind of populist celebrity type leaders who use nationalism essentially as the kind of core appeal. He's different in the sense that the others don't at least consciously use buffoonery, right? So Johnson is a kind of postmodern extra added version of it, right, where everything is in quotation marks, nothing is serious, all that sort of stuff. But he's tried to use the same things, and as John was saying, the big problem with this is that this gesture, right, is based around the fact that I embody the nation. That's the basic story that Trump tells, that Orban tells, that Modi tells in India, whatever. And to some extent, in a bizarre way, that worked for Johnson. It's very hard to understand how people would say, yeah, he embodies my nation. I really think that's great. But he won an 81-seat majority, and huge numbers of people. So the celebrity thing kind of worked for him. It's created this bond somehow, and people like him and identify with him. But it suddenly collapses when you need something different. You actually just need competence. You need Gordon Brown, like you need a Duer Scott, who's just saying, this is what you're doing. This is what, this is how we're reacting. I mean, if you think about how quickly, and John knows much more about this than I do, but think about how quickly Brown responded to the global banking collapse in 2008, right? Very, very quick, very authoritative, had serious things to say and do with it. And then you think about just the incompetence of Johnson, the dithering, the inability to deal with it, because it's serious stuff. I don't want to deal with it. And just it's worth saying that the estimate of epidemiologists in Britain is that basically, they don't say this directly, but that the delay that Johnson was responsible for has cost somewhere between 20 and 25,000 lives. So he's killed tens of thousands of his own citizens through this incompetence. And I think that's where the pandemic changes the nature of people's relationship to these people, because you can only afford risk if you feel safe. It's the odd thing. If you feel I'm safe, I'll take a risk with everything. I'll throw everything up in the air. Throwing everything up in the air, doing the disruptive Dominic Cummings thing when everything is already being disrupted, when you don't feel safe, it just doesn't match.
But what does it say of the British
Can
public?
I add a thing on that?
Indeed, John. Yeah.
On Fintan's point about Johnson. I think that the celebrity. I know someone who knows him, and Johnson was 20 years ago saying that the old rule in Tory politics was that your capital, you made your fortune before you go into politics, and then you have it to spend when you're in high office. And he said people don't understand that the modern form of capital that you need in politics is celebrity. So the celebrity was a completely conscious strategy, and it provides a kind of insulation because he becomes a sort of character, and that acts as a kind of buffer. His sort of fundamental unseriousness is somehow priced in. It's taken for granted. The big problem with that, to Fintan's point, is he's incompetent, but also his whole shtick is incredibly English. It appeals to Southern Tories. It appeals slightly to people who, even if they don't like that type of person, know that that's a type of person that exists. And he, instead of places like going to Eton and studying classics being a liability, which it easily could have been, it's sort of part of his comic persona, and people allow for it. But it plays catastrophically outside England. And I was in Scotland a month or so ago, and it's a reminder, they're just deeply allergic to that kind of self-congratulatory, bluffing, superficial, woolly, stery English thing which thinks it's charming, but just other people just don't think it is. And just by being the kind of person he is, he weakens the union.
But what does that say, and I could just ask both of you that, John, what does that say then about the British public when you look at Gordon Brown's career, and so far when you look at Boris Johnson with his majority, and that they seem to forgive him? People know that he lies on occasion. He made a debate in Brexit, as Fintan unravelled, about a prawn crisp, and that it was under attack from Europe, which it wasn't. What does that say about the British public?
I think there's a problem with the word British. I don't think he is a British figure. I think he's very much an English figure. I mean, Fintan's written about this. I completely share his analysis. I think English nationalism is the single biggest threat, basically, to the British project, the project of there being a united kingdom. I think he appeals to an English audience, and I think that 2019 was a freak of circumstance, that thing that things were stuck things were broken, by virtue of voting for something that was impossible to deliver, Brexit. Essentially, nothing had changed between 2016 and 2019. And, Cummings came up with his three-word slogan, "Get Brexit done." And it's like take back control. It's a falsehood, it's an oversimplification. But it was just incredibly effective at the ballot box. Don't forget he was running against the least popular Labour leader since the dawn of time.
But Fintan, doesn't he get away with an awful lot that Theresa May never got away with, or Gordon Brown? What does it really say, to pick up on some of the issues that John raised there? What does it say? Because he's certainly no Churchill, which he models himself on.
He's the winner of a second prize maybe in a Winston Churchill impersonation contest, and but he is clever, you have to say. So he's not an idiot, right? He plays the buffoon, but he's not an idiot, right? And I think what John was saying was brilliant about that idea of realizing that the capital you needed to create was this celebrity, and he did it brilliantly. And he also has this. So what he's created, right, is and it worked up until the pandemic, right? Is this idea that. And I think this is very English, right? Which is that actually taking things seriously marks you out as a bore, as somebody who doesn't get the point, doesn't get the joke. So his racism, for example, he is a racist. He's used racism all through his career, but he uses it cleverly in a way where we say, "Oh, come on, of course I'm not a racist. It's just a joke. If I call black children pickaninnies, well, sure, it's just a funny little word, isn't it? If I talk about their watermelon smiles, well, that's just, it's just funny, isn't it? And that does appeal, I think, to a population which is deeply disillusioned with politics, right? So when people are disillusioned with politics, they say, well, at least he entertains us. And I think there's a weird thing that happens then as well, when it's not just in England, it's very much with Trump, this paradox of authenticity, right? So that when people are so disillusioned by politics, they start thinking, well, they're all liars, they're all just frauds. So the one who's an open fraud, the one whom you know is lying to you, is authentic. And I remember watching a screening on, I think on Channel 4 of a focus group during the election in Britain, and it was in one of those Midlands seats, the red wall seats, which subsequently the Tories won by a handsome majority. And there were people saying, these were working class Labour voters, and this woman was saying, Boris, he lies. If he lied to the Queen, he would lie to anybody. And you know what? He reminds me, do you know what he really reminds me of? A bog brush. He really reminds me of a bog brush. Look at him, the way he looks. And I really like him, and I think I'm going to vote for him. And it's that sort of, so you would have these sentences, the first bit of which, if you were watching as a pollster, you'd be like, oh my God, this is a disaster for this man. People really, don't take him seriously at all. And the second part of which was, I'm going to vote for him. And I really like him. It was this likability notion that he's not pulling the wool over our eyes because we can see what he's doing, and he's a kind of lovable buffoon, and that's kind of nice.
But he also has a plan, and I'm not talking about Brexit necessarily. Misha Lenny pointed out, described him, you called him as the strong men, he called them the iron men, and they say they're swept in by, democratically, but then they try to undo all the democratic pillars around them, the attack or undermining of the BBC, the overhaul of the courts, the civil service. These are not positive actions, John, of a leader and someone who believes very strongly in democracy.
No, I don't. I think that his henchman, Dominic Cummings, has analysis of the British state not functioning as well as it should, that the institutions don't do what they're supposed to do, which I think, is defensible, actually, as an analysis. But it's a bit like the Brexit being an attempt to address valid concerns about not being listened to, being ignored, being left behind, with a completely false completely irrelevant answer, you know, because whatever the things that were wrong with Britain up to 2016 were, Brexit is like a category mistake of an answer. It just doesn't address any of the things it pretends to address. And I think part of what's coming with this moment with Johnson and Cummings is actually a feeling that the British state isn't sufficiently modernised, that the civil service doesn't function the way it should, that there are kind of disconnections inside it, with exactly the wrong solution, which is a doubling down on the dose of populism and doubling down on the idea that it's all someone else's fault. If government isn't functioning properly, it's the fault of the BBC or it's the fault of the court, or it's fault of a liberal elite. And failing to address the fact that a lot of the things that are wrong with the state in Britain are actually to do with competence. We have got in a cycle of persistent redesigns of things like our education system, our health service, things like that. And in general, people don't want a fundamental redesign of the health service. They just want the health service the way it is, but working better. People don't want a fundamental redesign of education. They want the system as, but they just want schools to be better. And this thing about a crisis of competence in government, I think, underlies a lot of the kind of problems of dissatisfactions of the British state. And just to come back to the point, Johnson is precisely the worst person in England to address it.
Fintan, I mean, you've said he's clever, and he has a plan. We may not like what he's pushing through, but he is pushing through his agenda in Britain in terms of the BBC, in terms of the courts, in terms of the civil service. That's very striking, where the Cabinet Secretary resigned or is resigning, but really was pushed.
Yeah. I mean, you see, Brexit is part of an authoritarian agenda, right? So you have to remember the reason why Brexit doesn't work. Like, let's just establish the fact that Brexit is an entirely legitimate thing to want to do. I think it's crazy, John thinks it's crazy, but, the European Union is a voluntary institution. You can leave if you want. It's perfectly valid in that sense. The problem with it is that it has to dress itself up as various things which it cannot be, right? So this is where it creates a kind of vacuum which gets filled by authoritarianism, right? So the first thing it presents itself as is a taking back control, right? And that's it was a brilliant slogan, and it's absolutely perfect because it addresses a genuine sense that people feel that they're not in control of their own lives. But what it then has to do, because that's just a slogan, it has to actually do the opposite, right? Which is to centralize control. So one of the very powerful things you would find talking to English people was, I am fed up taking rules from unelected bureaucrats. What do you get? You get the Dominic Cummings administration. And Cummings is a much more powerful figure than Johnson is. Cummings is Cummings' agenda. That's
and he
dominant.
Actually effectively got rid of the last.
As you say, so we've had cabinet secretaries gone, and now we've had the head of the civil service going. And so that's one of the paradoxes, right? Is take back control becomes centralized control, have it much more authoritarian. The second thing, of course, is that it's a nationalist revolution which won't say it's a nationalist revolution, right? So it says this is nationalism against Europe, but then you can't have Scottish nationalism against Britain, right? So the nationalism is supposed to stop somehow as an expression of your identity and being only about Europe. And that then means that you have to deploy nationalism in a very negative way, right? Which is, if you can't have a positive content to your nationalism, what do you fill it with? Well, you fill it with, and we've seen this over and over again in other countries, you fill it with traitors. Who's against the nation, right? So if you can't say what it's for, you can always say, well, it's not them. It's not the citizens of nowhere. It's not the immigrants. It's not the liberals. It's not the Scots. It's, and you can go on because there's any number of nots available, right? But that also leads towards an authoritarianism because you're identifying enemies and you're saying they're not us. And the third paradox then, of course, is that it's a conservative revolution, right? That's that paradox, right? And the problem with a conservative revolution is that you have to throw everything up in the air, make everything unstable, in order for it to stay the same, or to have a version of what you think it should be like from the past. And that doesn't work either. I mean, one of the reasons why the Brexit thing has become such a nonsense is that it's the most weird appeal to people. What's basically saying is, this is the biggest moment in our history for at least 50 years. It's one of the great moments, as Jacob Rees-Mogg says, it's Crécy, it's Agincourt, it's Waterloo, you know. It's like one of the great moments in our history, but economically it will change nothing. We will still have all the benefits of being in the European Union. You don't have to worry about any change, you know. So everything is changing, nothing's changing. So you've got these three big paradoxes, and they don't make, the thing doesn't cohere, it doesn't make any sense. And then you have to fill it with, what is it? Well, what Cummings will tell you really deep down, and you read his appalling blog post, right, is it's disruption for the sake of disruption.
Now, on that very note of Dominic Cummings, enter John Lanchester, he didn't go. He didn't resign. He wasn't asked to resign. And I don't think you know, it's happened here where people have had to resign, and I don't think anyone would put us up as the model, you know. But at the same time, it was extraordinary that he didn't go.
And has cost an unquantifiable amount of political capital. I mean, as clear a self-inflicted wound as you can get. And I think it'd be easier to just, my feeling at the time is I prefer him just to go on TV and say F off. You know, rather than say, I was worried that I couldn't see, so I put my kid in the back of the car and drove 60 miles to test my eyesight. It's better to just tell people to F off, because that's in effect is what he's saying. F off, I'm not resigning. And, you know, even the Sunday Sport, who never write about politics, you know, their ideal headline is "Statue of Elvis found on moon," and the front page was, you know, shock announcements for British elite: don't drive if you're blind. And then a cut-out mask of Cummings. Cut this out and put it over your face, and you can do anything you want.
I'm just wondering how Fintan is going to follow that up in illustrations, hand movements. On that note,
I mean, I often think of that great thing in Irish politics of the Gubu factor. Do you remember that? Grotesque, unnatural, grotesque, unbelievable, bizarre, and unprecedented.
Yes.
And you know, we in the UK, a lot of Gubu factor at the moment.
We'll trade it, you know, in the new regime. We can export Gubu to you, and you can have it. But it is, you know, it's not trivial, because, you know, the fundamental test of whether a democracy is working is whether or not someone who openly flouts the rules that apply to everybody else can stay in office. You know, it's a really basic test, you know. And again, this is the great paradox, of course, isn't it? So the Brexiteers who kept saying, you know, the problem is with the European Union, it's full of these completely unaccountable bureaucrats whom nobody elected, you know, and who don't have to answer to anybody. Well, Phil Hogan had to go, and he had to go because of moral pressure. You know, democracy worked. You know, the ordinary people, not just in Ireland, but around Europe. I mean, von der Leyen this was a European issue, and von der Leyen was thinking, if this guy doesn't go, this really damages the credibility of the European Commission, and we can't have that. And it was really clear she wasn't going to keep him there. And the Irish government was thinking the same thing. And this is not to say that, you know, the European Union is a perfect democracy or that Ireland is a perfect democracy, but there's something still functioning, you know, when that level of basic accountability still functions. And when the Cummings thing happened, and as John was saying, it was beyond the F off. You know, I have such contempt for you, right, that I'm not even going to bother. I've had lots of time to think up a story. I'm not even going to really bother, you know. I'm just going to give you some complete nonsense. And I don't care whether you believe it or not, but it's because, you know, and you can only do that if you know that you are entirely unaccountable. And you can only be unaccountable as an advisor if you know that you control the Prime Minister, right? So it's impossible to think of any other version of this in the history of British democracy. You know, where as John was saying, like, so you're a new prime minister, you've got that amount of political capital. You know, it's a fixed sum, and you spend it over however long you can stay in power. You're going to spend what, half of that on one unelected advisor who's not even a member of the Tory party, by the way. You know, I mean, this was a demonstration of raw power. The power to be able to say to the overwhelming majority of Scots and Welsh people and Northern Irish people and English people, I don't actually give a good goddamn what you think. I'm in power and I am untouchable.
And you've pointed out before, even before this began, about the contempt for rules, Boris Johnson's contempt for rules. But even some of the ministers, but Dominic Cummings, it was so blatant. We've seen scientific officers having to resign. What does it say on a positive note about here that there is now a culture of resignation? Because in the past it might have been in Britain where people resigned when they were caught, and not necessarily here. There has been kind of a reversal, because Derek Leary resigned very quickly.
Yeah, you know, I mean, we're far from a perfectly functioning political system or culture. But you know, there's still a thing called the moral economy. You know, there was a phrase that historians used to use about, you know, the way things happened in pre-modern societies. You know, there was a notion of certain things you could do and couldn't do. And I think because Ireland is still a very intimate local society, you know, everybody saw in the Oireachtas Golf Society thing their own community. You know, all the people who've been doing extraordinary things in their own community of, you know, delivering meals or, you know, helping out people, or without being asked, without any thanks, without any publicity, you know, and they saw all of that just being kind of saying, well, that's for you guys, it's not for us. And that was just fundamentally morally unacceptable. And I think what's happened and at least, you know, to be fair, we still have a ruling class that somehow still recognizes that when it sees the outrage, it got it. I think, and you know, John would be very interesting in this, but I mean, you know, I've been saying this for a long time, but I mean, I think, you know, not to be too French revolutionary about it, but you have a decadent ruling class. You know, you have a ruling class which has completely lost any sense of having responsibility to rule. It doesn't want to rule, it wants to be in power. It wants to use the power, it wants all the perks of power. It wants to give contracts to its friends. It wants to appoint its brother to the House of Lords. It wants to do all that kind of rubbish. But it's actually not interested in ruling. And this is astonishing. You know, this was a ruling class which did rule huge chunks of the world, you know, which has very deep traditions of being able to manage things like wars and empires and, you know, God knows what. And it lost any connection with society, you know. So and Johnson is a kind of perfect version of that, but Cummings even more so.
And doesn't this hark back, John?
I think one thing about that, though, I think it's a sign of it's one of Fintan's paradoxes, that the open contempt and the you know, sort of untouchability and, you know, I'm not going to go and you can't make me. I think it's a sign of extraordinary weakness on Jonathan's part, because the only reasons Cummings is untouchable is because Johnson can't govern without him. He doesn't have an agenda. Well, I think it's more likely that, you know, Johnson, he wanted to win. You know, as a boy, he talked about, you know, his ambition to be king. It's a little bit like Cameron saying he wanted to be prime minister because he thought he'd be good at it. But that's not a reason for being prime minister. You want to be prime minister or Taoiseach because there's specific things you want to do for your country. Johnson doesn't actually have a plan beyond this sense of winning, coming top, coming ahead of the, you know, at the top of the greasy pole. And he genuinely needs Cummings. He's completely dependent on him because he doesn't actually have an agenda otherwise. He doesn't have a program of government. And so there's a deep, deep weakness embodied in that, because it was obvious to absolutely everyone that Cummings had to go. And yet he didn't.
And I suppose he was facilitated, I suppose, if I think of the Irish example, there's no way he would have been let away with that in Ireland by the media. There is a compliant media in some parts and a partisan media in Britain at the moment, in some quarters.
It's partly to do, it just reflects brute realities of power. Johnson's just won an 80-seat majority. And don't forget that was more recent, but back in April, May. And what happens is that as governments leak away power and authority, everybody gets braver. The papers get braver. You've seen it in America with the way reporters are being much, much more aggressive with Trump now that they suspect to be on the way out. And the whole sort of structure and institutions of public life, the tone changes once it looks like governments are critically weakened. But a British Prime Minister with an 80-seat majority is close to in a completely invulnerable position in any democratic system anyway. There aren't checks and balances in Britain. That's a deliberate thing. That's to have kind of clear outcomes one way and the other. Give it another 6 months or so, Cummings wouldn't have been able to survive that because the political capital has been burned through. Everyone's sick of them.
Would you still bet on him not being re-elected?
On Johnson not being re-elected, if I had to bet right now, I would say Johnson won't even lead the Tories into the next election. The Tory party is the most successful political party in democratic history, right? It's essential, although it wasn't called at the time, but it's more or less been in power for most of the time since the early 19th century. It's astonishingly good at holding power. And it's very good at doing that because it is absolutely viciously ruthless with its leaders. It gets rid of them when the balance of advantage seems to lie with doing so. Remember, they ruthlessly knifed Margaret Thatcher, who was one of the most successful figures in their entire history, whom they idolize. I think John has expressed it very well. But Johnson is not going to cease to be a liability. He's going to become more and more of a liability as time goes on. Simply because it's not that, he can't reboot, he can't do something else. He can't just say, actually, I'm not the buffoon anymore. Because actually his skills, he doesn't have other skills, right? So he doesn't have administrative skills. He's no good on the detail. He doesn't have a real plan or an ideology or something that he really wants to achieve. Once Brexit is done, I think that's when the danger for Johnson really kicks in. The ERG, the Brexit hardliners, want him to be in power to get them to a no-deal Brexit, which is their nirvana. And in a way, once that's achieved, and when all the blowback from the pandemic really starts to hit in the spring, I would be skeptical about whether Johnson can hold on or whether he's not going to be replaced.
And I'm going to ask John that question because we've seen with Donald Trump in 2016 where the normal rules didn't apply. And that video with that derogatory remark about a woman, there's no political leader that I can think of, or many people can think of, that would survive after that becoming public. And I know we're going to go to questions. Do you think he will be re-elected? Obviously, it depends on the timing. But would you see him, his days are gone, or do you think the elastic band will come back?
I thought that the only upside of coronavirus was that it would cost Trump the presidency. I think without it, he might have beaten Biden, but I don't think, I can't see it. Winning. Having said which, there's this terrifying thing, that polls are famously less good as a predictor of the future than betting markets. In the world of finance, they look at betting markets, not at polls. And if you want to really frighten yourself, go and have a look at the betting markets in the American presidential election, because currently it's a dead heat.
Okay. I'm going to open it up to questions, and there's plenty. We didn't even touch on the monarchy or other issues with the royal defections. Does anyone have a question, please? And this gentleman here in the front. And I'm going to group a few together. Yes?
Just wonder if the panelists might choose questions out, a lot of focus obviously on Johnson here, but on the lack of alternative, on that with the Labour Party, and there being no real alternative there. And I just wonder if you might tease that out a little bit and where they're going now. There seems to be improvements, but maybe just talk about that a little bit, please.
Okay, and there's another gentleman over there. I'm just going to group some of them together. Yeah, thank you, by the way.
And what did the panel think about the future of the position of Northern Ireland in United Kingdom or in some kind of United Ireland? Is that something which will happen in the relatively recent in the future?
Okay, and anyone else? Okay, the two questions there. First of all, to John, the lack of an alternative in terms of the opposition and the Labour Party to Johnson, because he dominates so much of the debate, and he dominates so many of the headlines. Now, we've seen his 26-point lead and the Conservatives' 26-point lead evaporate this year. But what about the lack of an alternative? Is Keir Starmer not doing a good job, or what's your analysis there?
No, Starmer's done a much better job than Corbyn, and there are polls putting them almost neck and neck. I think I totally agree with Fintan. I don't think Johnson will fight the next election. Apart from anything else, he's not up to it, and also, frankly, I don't think he's fully recovered. So I think the next election will probably be Sunak against Starmer, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor. And I think it's actually going to be quite a difficult election for Labour, because the Tories will have destroyed their reputation of competence by that point. Brexit will either be a full-on disaster if we have a hard Brexit, or a functioning arrangement like the one we used to have when we were in the EU, except a lot more expensive and with no lawmaking power. And so one or either of those pennies will have dropped, but the Tories will be in a weak position. But it's quite hard for Labour to fight on the platform of anti-austerity, support for industry, things like that, against a former Chancellor who spent more money propping up the British economy than any Chancellor in history. And I think Johnson would be an easy person to defeat in 4 years' time. But I think Starmer is a formidable campaigner. He makes Johnson visibly nervous at parliamentary questions. But I think the actual Tory he'll be running against, I think it'll be quite tricky.
What do you think of the Labour Party and under Keir Starmer? And I suppose, as our audience member said, the lack of an alternative. I think you've mentioned before the absence of Brexit in his policies, that he keeps it low.
Yeah, I mean, Starmer has decided not to talk. Just don't say the B word. Just whatever else you say. Just no, we're not talking about Brexit. And in a way, strategically, he's probably right, because he can't win on it. Right. Legally, the argument's over, right? They've left. The transition is coming to an end even now. I think he may be in a position to begin to criticise preparations for it and the detail, but I think the issue itself is probably no win for him. I think Starmer is impressive. I think he showed incredible courage and patience under Jeremy Corbyn, to keep plugging away on Brexit and on all of those issues. He's a formidable figure. I think, though, there's a reason why Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party. I mean, there's a reason why the sort of centrist, third way Labour Party collapsed, right? And John's written so brilliantly about this, but it led to the financial crash. It was that idea that we don't really need socialism, we just need to let finance capitalism rip, and then what the left will do is spend the money, get enough taxes and use them, nicely and did. I'm not, very important things about child poverty and all sorts of very, very good stuff using it, but the left doesn't have an economic model, right? Which doesn't go down that road, and at the same time is more convincing than the model that Corbyn came up with. It seemed to me that the irony was that actually Labour's manifesto, not in the last election, but in the Theresa May one, was actually a very, very good manifesto and was very sensible, very popular. It just didn't have anybody convincing to sell it. And then what they did in the last election was basically repeat that manifesto and then keep adding something else every day, free broadband, for everybody. And so just destroy the credibility of it, which was already very weak with this very unpopular leader. But I think Labour has a real chance of rebuilding. But I take John's point. I mean, the economics of it are going to be very interesting. What's your alternative to a Tory who's spending lots of public money, and we don't really know what that is.
And Fintan, we had another question there about the future of the position of Northern Ireland in the Union and possible united Ireland, perhaps.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because, and it's a difficult question for us, I think, because the British used to claim for centuries that they had an Irish question, the Irish question. How are we going to solve the Irish question? And we now have a British question, which is whether it's all nice to have a certain amount of schadenfreude, about, I often think it's like there's a fixed amount of crazy nationalist angst on the two islands, when it went down on our island, it just went up on the other one, and it's kind of nice to be looking at it from the outside. But it's not funny because, of course, it has very profound implications for this island. Britishness is a part of this island. There's 1 million people on the island who have a British identity. Exactly what that means is, of course, very much open to question, but it's something that we have to deal with, and we have to deal with, again, with another huge paradox. Let's imagine the Union breaks up, which it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that if we're here in a couple of years' time, Scotland has voted for independence. That's the end of the Union. What are Unionists in Northern Ireland united to if there's no Union? What does Britishness mean if Britain as an entity no longer really exists in the way that anybody has ever understood it? And yet, remember, we are constitutionally obliged to respect and sustain the British identity of those in Northern Ireland who wish to choose it. That's what we voted for when we voted for the Belfast Agreement. They have the right to be Irish or British or both as they may so choose. That doesn't change. So, yes, all of this makes a united Ireland much more likely, but not in conditions that any of us were thinking about, right? So this is not our story anymore in a way. It was supposed to be an Irish story, just as Scottish independence was a Scottish story. But it's fundamentally dependent now on what happens in England and on where this kind of strange, anarchic, risky, buffoonish polity leads itself over the next couple of years. We're going to have to pick up the pieces. So I would love to see United Ireland, but I really worry that it's going to be United Ireland by default as a result of somebody else's chaos. We've got to pick up the pieces. And this is why I think it's really important for us that we need to be engaging now. I think there really needs to be a non-threatening, non-aggressive, genuinely open, genuinely pluralist dialogue about what's the future of this island if there's no union. And it has to be conducted in a really gentle, sensitive, respectful way that's not threatening anybody's identity. But there is some urgency to it, right? Because this is something which is happening, it's moving, and we really need to be trying to deal with it somehow.
And John, on the note of Scottish independence, obviously Nicola Sturgeon lost seats the last time. She'll be leaving the stage at some point in the near future. What's the prognosis there?
Well, I'd have thought, funny enough, if you're making a positive case for the future of the Union, it would turn on the idea that Labour can't govern without the SNP. Labour has lost Scotland, and it feels permanent to me. That doesn't feel like something that's going to, revert to the mean. That feels like a profound historic shift. So, in the event of Labour being the biggest party in the UK Parliament, they would SNP to govern. So you would have a kind of, paradoxically perhaps, a stronger link between Westminster and the other bits of the UK than you've had, instead of being ruled by, Tories from Westminster who, effectively regard Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as colonies.
Now, final question for both of you. 2030, you're writing a column and you're looking back at the pace of change as John did in 2018. Can you make 3 predictions of what you would see in relation to the state of the United Kingdom, or things that may have surprised you, or just things that may have happened? I think both of you believe that Boris Johnson is not going to be Prime Minister or even leader of the Conservative Party. Who wants to go first?
Hoping John might, but
he's been a gentleman this time.
I think I've been planning all along, if things got tricky, that I pretend that the thing is frozen, so I might go.
Fintan, I think you win.
Okay, so well, I would just say these as things that are more probable than not, right? Rather than because I think anybody who makes predictions right now, we're in a very strange time. But I would suggest that at the very least, the shape of the United Kingdom will be completely different from what it is now. Right? If it's going to survive, it's going to survive as a radically reformed federal state, a genuine federal state, right? Rather than this sort of Westminster-centered polity. But I would think that's 50-50. So, you know, I would say at the moment the odds are on Scottish independence, and that's very profound. So there may not be a United Kingdom in the terms that we're currently thinking about it. Secondly, I would suggest that there will be a reapplication to join the European Union.
I feel a column coming on.
Why? Simply because Brexit doesn't solve the problem that led them into the common market as it was then in the first place, right? The white paper that was led to British membership of the common market just phrased it very simply. It said, if we don't join the common market, we will have left aside an imperial past and rejected a European future. And where will we be? And the imperial past isn't coming back, much as some of them would like it to. The European future is gone, but there is no other place for Britain to be, or England to be, or whatever that polity is. It's still an island in Europe. You know, it cannot function, I think, in any other way. And I think we will end up with a profound rethinking of that. And the third thing, and this is completely what I would hope to see rather than what I predict, but I do think there will be a return to social democracy. You know, to the great English, British, social democratic revolution of the post-war years, you know, because I think this is going to happen to all of us. I mean, you know, it's not just a British thing, but you know, if you look at the profound attachment people have remade with the NHS, you know, which is the great survivor of British social democracy. You look at the fact that the universities, for example, are completely unsustainable now as privatized institutions. You know, I think we're going to have a revolution in people coming back after the pandemic and saying, okay, what's important? And I think that could profoundly alter the political nature of Britain, you know, and rediscover those great post-war values, maybe.
Thank you. And John, you've given us one version of the future, a very pessimistic one, in The Wall, rising tides, and of course a migrant crisis, a refugee crisis. What's your vision for the UK in 10 years' time when you're writing that column?
Well, the first and likeliest prediction is that at the moment UK gets 40% of its energy from abroad and 40% of its food from abroad. And those numbers will be the same because they're consistent. So, which is one of the reasons Brexit is, in my view, a bit of a waste of time, because those fundamental. I mean, nothing's more fundamental than where you get your food, where you get your energy, and there's no reason to think that will change. I think a penny will have dropped that most of the big problems facing the modern world are problems that nation states can't solve on their own. The two biggest are climate change and immigration. Immigration is often linked to climate change, and that will be increasingly obvious by 2030. And so that might well lead to a shift in the social democratic direction, but it certainly creates a pressure to move back towards international institutions, back towards pan-national and supranational institutions which can address these problems can't address climate change as an individual nation state. And I'd have thought that the likeliest thing would be a direction back applying towards an EU that might well have slightly changed. I think the likeliest future for the EU is the thing that Konrad Adenauer, the German Chancellor, said when it was being founded. He talked about a Europe of multiple geometry. And I think the likeliest thing is that you'll have, it's not quite a core and periphery, but you will have some countries that have an effectively unified fiscal and monetary system, and other countries that are a bit like Lego attach onto this in different ways. A little bit like what you have now with countries like Norway and Iceland. I think that Britain will be heading back in that direction, probably with some degree of fairly fundamental, if not a breakup of the UK, then an increased kind of devolution and more powers. And the thing that governments have talked about the country but not actually done, of actually giving more power at the local level. I think that the weaknesses of the British state can't be addressed without that.
John Lanchester, Fintan O'Toole, thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks to our online viewers. That was grim. We couldn't expect it to be otherwise. Perhaps in 10 years' time, Boris Johnson will be in an old person's home babbling to himself, being visited by his very many children, both acknowledged and unacknowledged. That might be a good outcome. I want to thank our two fantastic speakers, John and Fintan, particularly John coming to us from his shed in London, and we're very grateful to you for that, and our wonderful moderator, Martina Fitzgerald. Thank you very much. Good night.